Hello, everyone. Good afternoon to all of you. I'm Kirk Watson. I'm the mayor of Austin, Texas. And as mayor, I get the honor and, frankly, the enjoyment of recognizing people and programs and events in the community that are special to our community by issuing proclamations. And I happen to have one here. I would like to invite Stephen Mills and Cookie, if you would come up, because we want to recognize Stephen Mills and Light, the Holocaust and Humanity Project, with this special proclamation. Nice to see you. Good to see you. Thank you. Unfortunately, at the City of Austin, we print these proclamations smaller than Be it known that whereas Ballet Austin, ACLU of Texas, and the Anti-Defamation League will convene to discuss the protection of human rights against bigotry and hate through art, education, and public dialogue. And whereas Stephen Mills, Light, the Holocaust and Humanity Project, created in 2005, continues to provide forums for public dialogue about anti-Semitism and shines a light on the issues of the Holocaust and their relevance to our community today. And whereas the City of Austin condemns bigotry and anti-Semitism and celebrates the Jewish American story of courage, resilience, and hope, now therefore, I, Kirk Watson, Mayor of the City of Austin, Texas, do hereby proclaim March 8th, 2023 as Austin's Day of Light. I want to thank all of you for being here today at the LBJ Presidential Library for what I know is going to be a productive discussion about anti-Semitism and the role of disinformation and propaganda in dividing communities. Across the nation, we're seeing a rise in anti-Semitic incidents, and Central Texas, unfortunately, is not immune. In October 2021, a North Austin synagogue was set on fire by an individual with white supremacist beliefs, causing hundreds of thousands of dollars in damage to the sanctuary and building and ripping at the fabric of our city. That same month that happened, Anderson High School was vandalized overnight with graffiti, including a swastika spray painted on the equipment shed next to the tennis courts. To understand how we got here, we must look back at history. More specifically, we must look back at the role of disinformation and propaganda in isolating groups of people. Today's moderator, Mark Updegrove, knows a great deal about this subject. Mark Updegrove is a presidential historian as well as the president and CEO of the LBJ Foundation. Please join me in welcoming Mark to the stage.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and welcome everybody. We're delighted to have you here at the LBJ Presidential Library. I'd like to recognize Ballet Austin for bringing us together for this important conversation about protecting human rights against bigotry and hate. And today we have that conversation with three remarkable individuals. Stephen Mills, who you just saw on stage here, is Ballet Austin's Sarah and Ernest Butler Family Fund Artistic Director. In 2005, he premiered his ballet, Light, the Holocaust and Humanity Project at Bass Concert Hall. The contemporary ballet shares the remarkable story of Holocaust survivor Naomi Warren, taking the audience on a journey that takes place in the past while making relevant connections to the present day, including the issues that we face in human and civil rights. The production is toured both nationally and internationally, featuring both the 84-minute dance work and community-wide dialogues focused on the protection of human rights against bigotry and hate, just like the discussion we're about to have today. The production returns to Austin later this month and challenges communities to work collaboratively to consider the difficult issues relating to the Holocaust. Also joining us is Oren Segal, the Vice President of the Anti-Defamation League's Center on Extremism. Oren leads the organization's effort to combat extremism, terrorism, and all forms of hate in the real world and online. Much of Oren's time with ADL has been devoted to evaluating the activity and tactics of extremist groups and movements from across the ideological spectrum, working with law enforcement and publishing reports and articles on a wide range of extremist topics. In 2006, Oren was recognized by the FBI for his exceptional service in the public interest, and he was named to Forward's list of 50 influential, intriguing, and inspiring American Jews in 2019. And finally, we are joined by Oni Blair, the Executive Director of the American Civil Liberties Union of Texas. As the leader of this statewide organization, Oni directs staff across 6 cities to protect civil liberties and civil rights, including voting rights, immigration and border rights, LGBTQ equality, abortion rights, smart justice, and free speech. Oni was a Foreign Service officer with the U.S. Department of State for 13 years and directed the Human Rights Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs Office. She served as Special Assistant to the U.S. Deputy Secretary and worked in the U.S. embassies in Jordan, Pakistan, and Iraq. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Oni Blair, Oren Segal, and Stephen Mills. Well, welcome to all of you. Stephen, first of all, congratulations on your recognition of your stunning ballet.
Thank you.
And its great success. I want to just ask, we'll start with you by asking what the impetus of the project was. How did you come to know Naomi Warren, and when did it occur to you to capture her story in dance?
Well, I came to know Naomi sort of in a very circuitous kind of way. And the impetus for the dance came about as a result of my going on a journey after the events of 9/11. And that terrorist attack on our country was so devastating, but for me it was one of those moments where I really began to understand the ways in which hatred from abroad was coming towards us. I was looking for a place to put that. Artists have always been the documentarians of the times in which they lived, and I am no different in that respect. I had never thought about doing a work like this, but I was sort of driven there, and I had a communication with a friend of mine who knew Naomi, and Naomi and I met, and her, after hearing her testimony, which if you've ever heard the testimony of a survivor, you know it's very graphic and horrifying. But in her very calm, teacherly way, she sort of threw down the gauntlet for me and said, you're a citizen, just like I'm a citizen, just like everybody is a citizen, and you have a responsibility, and you have to help where you can, and this is where you can. And so that's really how it came about. So it came about as a need to reflect upon a historical event, and every time that we've brought it back, we haven't brought it back to sort of to retell the history of Naomi because, or any survivor, because that's been done, right? There's plenty of that sort of information out there. I bring it back for personal reasons, and the reasons it's back this time is because the country is grappling with some of the issues that were mentioned earlier, and the issues of the Holocaust are not done, I guess. And so we wanted to bring it back so that we could have just this kind of conversation that was relevant to today.
Oren, Ani, I want to ask you both, we'll start very broadly in this conversation, but why are we seeing a spike in hate, not only in America, but in the world? What has changed? And Oren, we'll start with you.
Okay, so we're going to start easy.
I'm glad you get to go first.
Yeah, I mean, the question of why, I think, in part, is access to narratives and tropes and propaganda that we know are intentionally created to create fear and anxiety, to inspire people to fear one another as opposed to support one another. And, when I heard you speak about the ballet, it's about providing access to important stories through a different medium. I will tell you that today, the anti-Semites, the bigots, the extremists of all kinds are using a similar approach, using social media, using propaganda, storytelling, to normalize the hate that we all, or many people, reject, but to normalize it, right? I think the biggest success, and I hate to talk about success when I'm talking about anti-Semites and extremists, is their ability to normalize these types of tropes so much that people don't even recognize anti-Semitism, extremism, and hate anymore. And when you don't even recognize it, that means that it's going to spread more readily. It'll animate people to action. It's spread in communities that are geared toward making people connected to one another, like you're part of something bigger than yourself, part of a movement. We all want to be part of that. But the extremists are leveraging those technologies in part to create meaning around hate, around scapegoating, and around isolating communities. And that's one of the reasons, and that's our biggest challenge.
So Ani, there are vehicles by which to do this, and we can talk about those vehicles and how they're being utilized. We'll drill down on that for a moment. But there are more people spreading this information. Why now? What has, again, I'm just trying to get a sense of what's happened in the past several years that has given rise to greater propagation of this defamatory material.
So I don't think there's a one thing. I think we like to blame a certain person in his recent history. But I also think that there's a complicitness that goes along with that.
Yeah.
And so as the hatred is spewed out, I think that many people have become complicit in allowing it to happen and not pushing back. So for instance, you take something simple as, it seems simple, such as book censorship. So in Texas, we have heard now for 2 years this uptick in book censorship in schools. And oftentimes I hear, oh, that's terrible. Those poor kids, they'll never hear about the things that we read about. But it's just a book. Or I've met with, a librarian from a place outside of Houston where I live who is like, well, it's not that bad. Is that really appropriate for a 5th grader to read or a 4th grader to read? And in this particular instance, we were talking about a story about Holocaust-related literature. But you let that happen enough, and suddenly there's no history. There's no history about the Holocaust. There's no history around Jewish people. There's no history or understanding of trans identities or Black identities. And suddenly there's a big hole in history and an understanding of the fights that we fought for people to be recognized as human, to have rights, the places where we've been as a country from the beginning of this country until now. And suddenly, the identities that are left, the white male heterosexual Christian dominant narrative becomes the only narrative that's still standing. And we're scratching our heads of how did we get here? Because nobody stood up the whole time to say that the small thing, which matters, that it actually does matter. And so when I hear the question of how did we get here, it is very obvious to me how we got here, but it's easy in retrospect. And you can see the same pattern, whether it's looking at book censorship. If you're in Houston, where I live, I have 3 children who are in public schools. We're now facing not just book censorship and dress code censorship, but suddenly the state is taking over our school district. It has very quickly gone from something small to something large. We see the same in voting rights, the chipping away of who can vote, the same in reproductive rights, the chipping away of different rights around it, and suddenly something is banned that we expected to be here. And so to get here, it's the small things and not paying attention that lead us to a place where we have forgotten. The tools that we have to remember are erased or restricted, and we're suddenly surprised when we don't have our rights.
Oren, I came upon from the ADL a very alarming statistic. Over 3/4 of Americans, 85%, believe at least one anti-Jewish trope today. And that's up from 61% in 2019. Why are people more susceptible to believe tropes just several years later, just since 2019? Why is that becoming more prevalent?
Yeah, I mean, it's a similar question to the first, which is, why now? What is it in our society that enables things that perhaps we were fighting against for years to marginalize, right? Tropes about Jewish people, tropes about other communities. Why is that so readily sort of available for people to glom onto? And again, I don't blame everything on social media. I sort of talked about that a bit in terms of normalizing. But I also think that this is what happens when democracy is under attack. I mean, sort of speaking a bit to what you were saying, when I joined ADL 20-something years ago, I was there to fight anti-Semitism and try to prevent extremists from doing bad things. I didn't realize that part of that fight would be the fight for the soul of our democracy, whether it's the institutions that we rely on, whether it's facts, right? Whether it is fundamentally believing in a structure that is supposed to support people. When that is eroded, when that is made to be in doubt, when disinformation is more easily accessible than legitimate news, and the younger you are and the deeper you are on social media platforms, the harder it is to even differentiate that. That's one of the reasons why this is becoming part of the norm. It's just that the way that we communicate, our technology has advanced much faster than our morality, and we are trying to keep up with that.
I'm interested in going back to the story of Naomi Warren for a moment. You got to know her, Stephen, in the latter part of her life. She died in 2016. I wonder, what were her views on the world when she was in her twilight years? How did she look at the world all those years later?
Naomi was the most generous person I think I've ever known. And she, I think when I first encountered her, it was just when the country was going to war in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I was in a training session with social studies teachers that Naomi was speaking. And it was at that very time that the pictures started to come out of Abu Ghraib. And I have to be honest and say that while I was willing to ask her tons of questions about her experience in camp, that was not a place I was able to go and ask her opinion on that. She was very active in her community, certainly, and particularly with the Holocaust Museum Houston, and as well as the very generous with her time in speaking around the country as well. So I'm not sure that she would have engaged in a political conversation with me, to be honest.
Yeah, yeah. I want to go back to something that Kirk mentioned, talk about the spread of disinformation. Ani, I'm going to ask you, so there was a tool that the Nazis used. They disinformed, and that led to extremism and hate. We're seeing that today, but how is disinformation used? What is the process by which those who purvey it use disinformation?
So that's a great question. And first I want to be clear, misinformation is when you mess up the facts. Like sometimes I mess up a statistic and that's not intentional, it's an accident. People do that. Disinformation is when you do that intentionally to mislead people. And this is where we see disinformation and propaganda being used across the country, including here in Texas, on things that we kind of take for granted. So you can see it, for instance, in the work around voting rights. So we need safety around voting because there are all these people who are going and voting illegally. Well, there is absolutely no statistic, whether it's local or national, to back that up, that there is rampant voter fraud in the state of Texas or really in any state. Yet, we're pouring out lots of money and investigations that investigate. One research done by the ACLU of Texas found 47% of people investigated for voter fraud were women of color. Women of color do not make up 47% of the electorate or people actually voting. Like it just doesn't, those don't connect. Disinformation on the border, that there is an invasion happening and everybody's going to come and take your things from you. That's not happening. Yet that misleading has justified over $4 billion being spent on operations along the border that are national defense and should be the role of the federal government, not the state government. And so this disinformation is weaponized to be able to justify actions that create a separation between the other, whomever we're blaming for something, and the action that we're choosing to take, or somebody is choosing to take to consolidate power, whether that's the state or an entity acting or something else. And you see that the otherizing in many different instances, whether it's blaming Jewish people or people who are immigrants or women or people who have children or people who are low income. That leads us to take actions that treat other people that in ways that we never would have imagined in a country where we want and are based on equality. That's what we profess. On democracy that's inclusive. That's the journey that we've been on since our beginning, and redefining what democracy means, that it's not for a few but for all. And it seems like that journey that we've been on has been forgotten, and how we are using the disinformation and seeing it play out in the country and in Texas.
Oren, is censorship a solution, or does that just give rise to more dangers?
I mean, it kind of depends on what people consider censorship. So here's what I don't consider censorship. When somebody is able to post a manifesto that cites great replacement theory about how Jews are manipulating the world and this country in order to have immigrants come from the borders and essentially foment the extinction of the white race, right? This is what white supremacists believe. This is what we hear sometimes on Fox News as well. All right, an adjacent version of that. So that disinformation, is it censorship to ask a social media platform that is giving access to those ideas, for example, to not do that anymore? These are companies that are making millions and billions of dollars based on the engagement that they have. They can decide what they will or will not allow on their platforms. They're private companies. Right? They can decide what they will allow. So if they decide that they will allow the spreading of these types of narratives that we know animate violence in Buffalo and Pittsburgh and El Paso and Charleston and Halle, Germany and New Zealand, and I can go on and on and on, right? I don't think it's censorship to say, can you use some of those billions of dollars to not allow that to spread so easily on your website or your social media platform or your video content or your gaming apps or your encrypted services? I mean, that's where these things are normalized. So I don't consider that censorship. Mm-hmm. If we're saying don't allow people to say certain things in the public square, I think that's probably a step too far. But we can also address that by lifting up voices that are using their freedom of speech to speak out against those who want to normalize that hate. But when it comes to social media, I don't think it's censorship. If you're going to tell people what they can and can't say publicly, that's a different issue, and that's where it's a battle of hearts and minds and truth.
Ani, I want to ask you too. relating to social media platforms. What do you think would represent sensible reforms as it relates to the way that social media platforms currently operate?
That's a really hard question.
Well,
I don't, go ahead.
Well, as an example, you have algorithms, for instance, the manifesto that Oren just talked about. If somebody posted a manifesto and I consumed that manifesto, right, I consume that content, the social media provider would be saying, well, if you like this manifesto, surely you would like this, and they're more and more extreme. I'm wondering if there should be reforms that we ask social media companies to put in place that would not allow the disinformation to be spread in that manner. In other words, if I consume one thing to disinform me, they're going to recommend other things that disinform me. So are there logical reforms that we should ask social media companies to enact to prevent this problem from spreading to the degree that it has?
I don't know what logical reforms would work at this point. I do know that incentives work, and whether you're incentivizing with a carrot or with a stick, incentives work. But I think that there is the other part of it is we also incentivize these platforms by willingly believing in them and not countering any sort of narrative. And so the temptation is, it's one part of it is there is the social media company, as you were speaking of, and what they can do, and they can do certain things to be able to block things, especially that are inciting violence, and there is precedent for not allowing to incite violence or specific actions. Also, we can create incentives by promoting or saying that we are seeking and speaking out against the disinformation and misinformation when it is promoted in propaganda. And I don't think that there's been an uprising of people really putting pressure to do that yet. Whether it's Congress or at a different level and working directly with companies, there is conversation, but I don't know that beyond advocates that we've seen the general public really put down a fine line to say that this is unacceptable. And that makes it difficult to create the political incentive for Congress or for even a state legislature to actually take hard action to do that. And so I say that with there probably are a million different things that we could do, but unless people actually say that this is what we want, no one's going to do them.
Yeah. Oren, what would a movement toward combating disinformation look like? A successful movement, to Ani's point?
So, I mean, disinformation exists in so many different places. Yeah. So perhaps the first way to answer that is a recognition of the various different places that disinformation, or what we used to just call lies with an agenda, right? Where those exist. So social media is one place. Sometimes it's often now in our politics, right? It's sort of a political discussion and who can sort of, promote the latest disinformation in order to attract their base. So that's a different sphere. Frankly, part of it is in our families, the people closest to us. So my first response to that would be, who's going to listen to you most? Is it the people that are closest to you? Does anybody here know somebody who's sort of subscribes to QAnon or QAnon adjacent conspiracy theories? I know a lot of people, and I combat extremism and hate for a living. And these are my friends, right, who subscribe to elements of that. But you know what? I can reach them because they're the closest to me. They're the people that may listen to me. And so we start with the communities around us. But then you're talking about a broader movement. I'll give a quick example. When Facebook was not acting strongly enough against anti-Semitism, Holocaust denial, et cetera, on their platform, ADL organized a Stop Hate for Profit campaign. And that included, nearly or actually over 1,000 different companies to say, we're going to stop advertising on Facebook for 1 month. Now, the idea here was not to shut Facebook down. It wasn't to boycott Facebook, but it was to show them that there are people of conscience, corporations of conscience, if that's not an oxymoron, right? But that are willing to say, you need to do more, and we are now united to do that. a small movement was created. Did it solve the problem of hate and harassment and extremism on Facebook or other places? No, it didn't solve it completely, but it showed people that there is strength when you are an ally, when you pool your voices together, and when you recognize that there's somebody or someone or some institution or some platform that you need to hold accountable. Accountability is a beautiful word, and we ought to say it and use it more often.
Stephen, I want to ask you, going back to your beautiful work here, how has that changed your perspective on the world?
Wow, okay.
These are small questions.
Well, I mean, you know, when you sit in that history and you really delve into it, and I'm not talking about the way one might in the American educational system. I'm talking about really understanding the issues of the Holocaust and the history of it. You learn pretty quickly that that the history repeats itself, right? And so learning about the ways in which Hitler was able to come to power, the way, as you say, used others in order to build that wedge. And then I forget what the statistic was, but in Germany, 3% of the population was Jewish, 5% of the population were actually voting for the Nazi Party, and the rest of the population was just indifferent, right? Because the propaganda machine had allowed for people to feel like, well, if this is happening to those people, then perhaps the government knows best and I should just stay out of it, right? So, you know, once you understand that and then you start to see things happening around you that are not by any means, you know, the Holocaust, but sort of echo those overtones, you realize that it matters who sits in the seats of power, who are the policymakers, and do I agree with those policymakers, and if I don't, how do I work for a better government, right? So voting has always been important to me, but I don't know that I'd give a speech like this where I don't say vote. And so that sort of civic engagement. I never really imagined that I would be working in a social justice field, you know, because of what I did. But the power of the project has shown me that there's more power than I thought. Yeah.
Ani, to Stephen's point, successful tyrants, successful demagogues find an other. What are examples of othering that you see in our state, in our nation today?
Sadly, right now in Texas, there are a lot of othering. So we see it in the legislative session is happening now, and so you see all sorts of things coming out. Othering, we see that in the, first of all, let me say this. A couple of weeks ago, we hosted an event with a Black-owned bookstore, and we did it at the public library in Houston. And it invited Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, kind of a preeminent writer on racial justice, and Nick Stone, a youth writer. And Nick Stone made this great example of othering is really about dehumanizing another person. And in order to do that, you kind of have to dehumanize yourself in order to really make that happen. And when I think of that, it was such a great way for me to understand what that othering is really doing. And so when I understand it in that way, I see it in the tropes around trans people, or even drag shows, and saying that people are doing all sorts of things just because of an expression that we see, an artistic expression, or their individual identity, and blaming LGBTQ persons along, you know, however they believe or whatever they identify as other, and dehumanizing them. We see that in our immigration, the work that we do. I think a really good example is if you think back to 2021 outside of Del Rio, the influx of Haitian immigrants who were coming after political upheaval and an earthquake in Haiti, and the dehumanization you see in the images of people being rounded up on horses with whips. To think of those instances, to think of how we treat and talk about trans people in the state, how we talk about drag shows, how we talk about people of various religions, Jewish, Muslim, to think about how we talk about or treat immigrants, putting them in cages, that's dehumanizing. That is othering. There is nothing that is a reflection of my humanity that I see in that. And that's not the state that I want to live in. I want to live in a state where people are allowed to come together and that what we actually say is what we believe. That democracy, as we have all reflected, is for everyone and is not this antiquated version that we began with hundreds of years ago. And so to get past that othering, I think that's the other part, is remembering to treat people with humanity, and that these things that we've allowed to happen around us, that we have to say something about them, that we can't stand for them, that we have to vote when people don't reflect that sort of priority or humanity in their work. And that we stand up together and sometimes do things along advocacy when there's not an option in the legislature to push back on it. That shows that we also have power and that the only power is not controlled in a single segment because we're not saying something against it.
Can I make a
Please
quick
do.
comment
Yes.
on othering? So I think you've laid out so much of the othering that's happening. I just want to put a fine point on the othering across the political aisle. Right, like I could tell you the statistics we have on anti-Semitic incidents in this country that are reported to ADL, last year being the highest ever recorded in the 40 years that we were doing this, right? Over 2,700 incidents of assault, vandalism, harassment. And similar with, you mentioned the LGBTQ community is in the crosshairs today, right? With not only the conspiracies, but people showing up, extremists and others, at events to harass, intimidate, and attack the LGBTQ community. But a lot of the sort of acceptable othering, I would say, is the one where people are pointing across the aisle and demonizing other people because of their political views. That is not a sign of a healthy democracy. It's not just that I oppose your, thoughts on the budget or, civil rights issues, or we have different approaches to getting, the country to a better place. Is you are the devil, you are evil, and you need to be killed because of your beliefs. That is not so far away from our public political discussion. And if we can't get that right, all the other othering is going to fall from there and trickle down.
How do you get that right? Ani just talked about power. We all have power, and I want to drill down on that in a moment. But how do you achieve greater moderation in our political debate?
Is that for me?
Either one, please.
Looking at you.
I mean, I can start, but appreciate it. I mean, how do we get there? Do I have the magic answer? I don't. But here's what we have to do. Yeah. Is hold people accountable and continue to call them out when they normalize the type of invective and rhetoric that we know not only marginalizes and isolates people, but could lead to violence. I mean, it sounds simple. It may be a little boring. It's not like this magical wand that will solve it. But when you hear political officials who are using anti-Semitism or other forms of hate as a political football, or who are normalizing the types of attitudes and ideas that demonize a whole other group of people, whether it's their political party, another political party, or whatever, we need to say that is not acceptable, that does not represent us, and then you go to the organization, community that was targeted, and you stand by them. One of the biggest myths that I hear is that there's no allyship anymore. I frankly hear this within the Jewish community, that when the Jewish community is attacked, where are all of our allies to stand up and condemn anti-Semitism? My synagogue was firebombed about a month ago. Luckily, nothing terrible happened, right? The security was in place, there wasn't a massive fire. 3 days later, 3,000 people from across, not just that community, but the state, from different religious backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, et cetera, showed up to be allies. I have seen how allyship is possible, how you can find the helpers if you look for them. So don't let people convince you that allies aren't out there. And knowing that is one way to push back against it.
I want to ask you, Oni, the same question. What do you do, what do you tell somebody who wants to give a voice to the voiceless?
So I think first we have to remember that everyone has a voice and that we can be allies to them, whether it's your experience or not. You can use your privilege, your space, your family, the time that you have to be able to amplify something that you believe in. I think often, and especially now, in all of the othering, that I sometimes find myself questioning myself and my actions. If it hasn't happened to me, do I still care? And the answer has to be yes. I will not be able to have every experience. That's just not going to happen. And I don't want every experience. To be really honest, I don't. But I have to remember and to have empathy and to have allyship, regardless of whether or not it's my experience. I'm not Jewish. I can show up at the synagogue to march because I care, because I know that's the right thing, because there's allyship, because I know if we forget that it could happen in my space of worship tomorrow. And that's important. So I think what you said, I absolutely agree with all of that. I also think that in the othering, especially across the political spectrum, that we have to remember that we do live in a pluralistic society. And just because somebody has one identity doesn't mean they have every identity that we've now bought into the stereotype that goes along with it. And so I'll use ourselves as an example at the ACLU of Texas. People are like, oh, you're with the ACLU, you must believe X. You must be in this sort of progressive camp. You must be with this political party. And I'm like, actually, we sued both the Biden administration and the Trump administration on the same issue on immigration, because it's not about that. And so it's not only the othering in one way, but also being able to speak up and remind people that we live in a pluralistic society. There are people who believe all sorts of things and who have all sorts of identities. And when we put people in boxes and we fail to recognize them for the complex persons that we represent, we are buying into these stereotypes, and it makes everything harder. So I don't know that there's a perfect answer to that, but I do think that we do need to speak up and to say something to remind people that you can't put me into a box. You don't know everything about me. I have differing opinions. I have different experiences, and that's okay. I don't want to be placed in a particular space on the political spectrum at one end or another just because you look at me and you see a black woman with curly hair, so obviously I must be in the woke camp, da-da-da-da-da. I may very well be, and that's okay, but that's my choice, and I want you to learn who I am before you place me there.
Stephen, how can artists best use their platforms to generate awareness about othering, about hatefulness, about bigotry, about injustice?
Well, I just want to recognize the artists of Ballet Austin are here today, and I made a work in 2005 for a specific reason, but they carry the message onto the stage, and they are the ones that have to do the teaching once people are in the theater. And I'm so proud and so grateful for all the work that they do. But even more than that, through the dialogue that we are having and will be having through the process of staging the work, they all learn. We all learn from one another. And hopefully, as you're saying, we all have our small communities. We each, including the dancers, have their own communities where they can be the teachers to those around them about this particular issue. So I think there's power in that.
Oren, according to PEN America, Texas banned 801 books across 22 school districts last year. Included in the list are books about the Holocaust. Art Spiegelman's Mouse and Anne Frank's diary, the graphic adaptation. What is prompting these actions? Why? Why are these books being banned?
I mean, I don't have a great answer to that other than fear, you know, inability to sort of see beyond your nose. I mean, I don't have the answer as to why, other than people are choosing to politicize everything. And when you politicize lessons from the Holocaust, like in Mouse, for example, I mean, it's not only offensive, right, but it belies the whole sort of years of lessons that were supposed to be learned from the Holocaust. One of the lasting lessons is to be not to be a bystander, to be an ally, to use your voice to make sure that in any way that you can, you don't allow injustice or hatred or isolation to be normalized. So if we're banning books that are supposed to be about not just tolerance, but what you can do in order to stand up for people, I don't have an answer as to why that is happening, other than people are trying to politicize it because they have been inspired by forms of disinformation that are telling people that if you sympathize with another group of people or you try to understand them, you're somehow weakening your own political, you know, position. I mean, that's absurd, but that's sort of the space that we're in now, where people feel like the only way they can either maintain or gain political power is to make sure that other people don't have it or that other people are not understood. So the why may be because it's a tried and true tactic that has worked well for fascists and tyrants and others for centuries.
I'd like to add to that.
Please.
I 100% agree with that. And I think it's important for people to really, really hone in on this. And I started with this piece on the censorship. We have the most number of books banned in schools in the state of Texas compared to other states, according to PEN America. And there are a lot of books about the Holocaust that have been banned. There are books about Black people by Toni Morrison, Ibram X. Kendi, they're all banned. There are books about trans people and experiences that have really helped students understand their journey on gender identity. They're all banned. There are books just about becoming an adult and puberty. Books that you may have read as a child that talk about menstruating or wearing a bra. Like, these are banned books. And it goes back to controlling the message and the identity, and also erasure of experiences. If I don't have a book that helps me to understand, you know, who I am when I don't have somebody, I don't have that ally yet, because I'm 12, you know, to be able to have a book to help you through that journey is so important. And I'm saying this now as a parent, but also as like a book nerd. I was the most awkward person in middle school and a late bloomer, and my mom would give me these books and be like, it's gonna be okay. You know, just read this. And it was so important to me to have that experience, and I want my children to have that experience. I'm not gonna have every experience that I can pass on to them, but to be able to share and to go through that is empowering. But when you shut that avenue down, you are shutting down the history, the remembrance, the lessons learned, not only as an individual, but as a society, from the impacted group or from the allies. And all of it becomes erased. The identity is erased. The history, why we got those rights and how we had to fight to get them, become erased. And again, you wake up and you don't have anything left, and you don't have a reference point with it. And the people who are hurt the most by the book censorship are kids in public schools. Because I'll be really honest with you, the wealthy private schools still teach all of these things. They have all the books on the shelves. They have, you know, actual critical race theory that is taught, which is actually not taught in any public school in the K through 12 levels. All of these things are just about power and consolidating it for a small group of people. And if we cannot see that, we are in a lot of trouble.
You wanted to add something, Stephen.
Well, I don't know that I want to follow that, but well, but what I was going to suggest, there are two books on that list. One is The Catcher in the Rye, which is a story of a young man coming into his sexuality and trying to decide what that's going to be, which was a really influential book for me. And To Kill a Mockingbird, which is the story of a black man falsely accused of rape. And so all of those things are true. And this idea that we shouldn't feel any guilt or any responsibility for anything that's ever occurred in our country, no matter what it is. And so I just throw those out because those two books were really instrumental to me as I was growing up in school.
There's the old adage, we read to know we're not alone, right? I want to go back to the issue of moderation for a moment, or you talked about political extremism and the fact that there's a lack of moderation earlier on. We sit in the presidential library of Lyndon Johnson, who got civil rights and voting rights and fair housing passed because of bipartisanship. We would not have had that transformational legislation but for Northern Republicans who added to the vote and ensured that they passed. How do we find greater political moderation in this country?
Yeah, like if I knew that, I would tell you. No.
But let me just posit that most people are somewhere in the centers, and the extremists on either side have an outsized voice. Yeah. So I want to go back to your notion of, I think, strength in numbers, allyship. How do you apply that same concept to greater moderation?
No, I get it. You know, and you would think that there are certain things that have happened in this country that would have brought people together. You know, whether it's kindergartners being shot by ARs, or an insurrection at the Capitol, or other, you know, sort of what everybody would think we would oppose. The fact that those things haven't been able to make people see eye to eye and agree suggests that this is a tough thing to do. But again, I think it's, at the end of the day, like when I look at, through my lens, which is the hate and extremism and the disinformation that is targeting people, everybody's going to be a target at some point. And in fact, everybody is. You know, when a mass shooter motivated by some ideology decides to shoot up a grocery store or a Walmart or a public space, they're not asking, are you Democrat, Republican, did you vote this way, did you vote that way, what's your background, right? It is ultimately a threat to all of us. And I don't know, maybe at some point, when there's enough destruction amongst, you know, in our society, maybe at that point people sort of see eye to eye. But right now, I don't have the answer. All I could say is that there is something to try to speak to people in a way that they'll understand. So I would ask people on the left to talk to people about the problems that you're seeing on the left, and the people on the right to talk to people on the right about the problems that you're seeing. So instead of the left attacking the right and the right attacking the left, people need to talk to the people they are closest to because they might hear you out. And maybe if we focused a little bit, again, on the people that are closest to us, the folks on our political wavelength, or even in our families on Thanksgiving, we might get to a place where we find common humanity. Because the thing that all this disinformation has done is make us not able to speak to one another. But I really believe if you talk to somebody who's very different and make that time, you'll find that you have more in common than not. It's just that those conversations aren't happening.
Ani, have you any thoughts on how we engender those conversations?
So I think Oren, you mentioned people who are different than us, than you are, than I am, as an identity, speaking to people who may be different than yourself. I think that that's a key part. And the part that I really want to hone in on is recognizing difference. I think that we have come through a time period in US history where we are scared to use words that are, that identify us because we were taught something else, and that is actually a problem. If I can't talk about Black people or Latinx people or trans people, then you don't know what I'm talking about. And then that way, it's hard to understand where there is a problem, where the othering has happened, if we're not comfortable talking about things specifically, if we're not comfortable with using terms of race or gender or sexual orientation or immigration status. Because when you don't do that, what happens is there's not an honest conversation. And when there's not an honest conversation of how systems may be benefiting or harming certain groups, then you can't have a conversation about how to fix them either. And so we have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. We have to sometimes recognize that, yes, some things may make us feel guilty. The intention is not around guilt. The intention is around understanding and being honest about what is happening, and not see it as another way of othering, but see it as a way of understanding the world around us. And as a consequence, once we identify things, and we can talk about things of how we share resources, how we share power, rather than saying, oh, well, if I talk about this, then maybe you want to take something away from me. Or being able to create a system that provides healthcare for everybody means that somebody loses healthcare, or voting for everybody means that somebody loses voting, or land for everybody means that somebody's losing land. It doesn't have to be that way, but we can't have honest conversations about it if we're complicitly participating in the othering by not naming what is actually happening in the United States and being honest about it.
And Stephen, your art catalyzes these conversations. You've been a part of conversations after your dance is performed. How do those conversations work? How do you lead those conversations successfully?
The conversations have been so varied based upon whether, the company has been blessed to be able to perform the work around the country as well as in Israel, and those conversations are very different, right? I always try to use, so we talk about the work a little bit, but I always try to direct the conversation in a more, what's happening right now, what's happening where you are, and ask questions. How does it affect you? How could you use this as a tool to be a benefit in your own community? Because ultimately, if it's not a tool, we shouldn't do it. We shouldn't be in this. We shouldn't, as a dance company, shouldn't be involved in this work if we can't use the work as a tool.
Oren, how should we be talking to young people about these issues?
Yeah, so, one of the things I often say is that the places where my investigators and analysts are spending so much of their waking hours looking for extremism and hate and campaigns, et cetera, is the same social media and other platforms that my two young children are on all day long, right? That's all you need to sort of know about sort of extremism and hate today, is that it's literally operating in the same spaces where people are getting their entertainment, their ability to communicate, et cetera. You have to say TikTok on every panel, so check there, I said it. But how do we reach people in ways that resonate with them? So I'll tell you, for some, a ballet or a play or a piece of artwork is the best way to open up their minds. For others, and I'm kind of half joking, but is to create some compelling social media content. And frankly, I think the bad guys that I monitor, that my team monitors, are creating really compelling content. And we're not competing with them, right? We're not even in the same stratosphere. How do you make, allyship and justice and combating hate as sexy and interesting and fun and ironic as the bad guys are, promoting their hatred? So one of the things we've actually started to do is start to work with some content creators to talk about how do you use your sort of positions, your influence, your techniques and skills to start telling important stories to people in a way that they are most likely to access it. Because they're not going to watch TV, they're not going to movies, they're in the social media space and they want to understand the world through that lens. We ought to provide them that option. And that's one way, is really thinking about content. And by the way, this is not about brainwashing and creating sort of messages and using algorithms to feed positive messages, right? I just mean create some alternatives so it's not 90% bad actors who are taking the time of our children on their screens.
Can I ask, Oren, who are the bad guys? Who are the bulk of the bad guys out there?
There's somebody right there. No.
Sir, can you stand up, please?
I mean, which bad guys do you want to talk about, right? I mean, a lot of the time that the Center on Extremism spends on is people that, want to promote hatred of others because they're Jewish, because of their race, because of who they love, and organize campaigns to harass and intimidate them, right? So there are, what is the profile of that? It doesn't really exist. I'll give you a story, though, that should be, make people uncomfortable enough to get a sense of who the bad guys are. It's not just the folks who are, arming themselves and doing mass shootings. Some of those are older folks, 51-year-old in Pittsburgh. Others are, teenagers in Buffalo. But there was a family whose son was killed by a white supremacist who created memorials for their child online. And once they created these memorials, they started getting harassed by people. Because that's what happens when you show empathy or care and you try to reach people with that in an online space. So I asked them, can you send me the handles, like the usernames, if you will, of the people that are harassing you for having to bear this awful tragedy in your family? Because I want to see if we could do some research. And we did a little research on that. We were able to identify about 20% of this massive harassers. And they were 13 and 14-year-olds. And they thought it was hilarious. I don't consider them hardcore, extremists that are going to march through Charlottesville tomorrow. But these are people who, again, don't necessarily understand what is happening, right? They think it's ironic, sort of meme culture. It's using images to sort of make a message. So I'm concerned about that they will become the bad guys, so we need to reach them early. And then there's a whole range of politicians I would add to the bad guys, but that's a whole other discussion.
I want to make sure we have time for your questions. Just ask a couple more and then ask for you to line up and ask any questions that you might have of our very distinguished panel. Stephen, I want to go back to Naomi Warren. One of the very stirring things that she talked about when she related her experience in the Holocaust is how hope sustained her. And she gave an example of somebody who didn't have hope and didn't have strength, and that person perished. She lived because she found hope inside her. Where did that hope come from?
Oh, I don't know. I only knew her as a hopeful person. And I think that you can look through lots of testimonies. Well, you could use Elie Wiesel, Dr. Elie Wiesel, and Primo Levi, both writers who lived through the Holocaust. One was liberated and came out positively and used his influence to educate others. And then Primo Levi, who the experience became so heavy for him that he killed himself, right? And so there are, every survivor's experience was different. Naomi, she talks about losing her, as you're saying, her sister-in-law, who just at the end of it lost hope. Naomi just knew every day that if she didn't go out to work, and she told me a story once that she had I don't know how she had a ruble. She had a Russian ruble, and there was one day where she didn't feel like she could go out. And she always carried this ruble with her in her mouth. And there was one day she didn't think she was going to make it back from the workplace back to camp. And she had this ruble, and she paid someone to carry her back. Because had she not gotten back to camp, they would have shot her right there. She just always found a way to, and I don't know, positivity I think is something that is in people. And some people have a lot of it, some people don't. But I think that also if we don't carry positivity with us and hopefulness with us, what else do we have at the end of all this experience if we don't think that as humans we can make change?
I want to ask you both, you're in this very difficult line of work when you're sussing out the bad guys and you're putting a spotlight on them. I want to ask you both, what gives you hope and Ani, we'll start with you.
No, I actually have a lot of hope. I take the long vision that change takes a lot of time. And I think that that's a result of my own family's history and watching what has happened through the eyes of my different family members, being a descendant of slaves in the US, and understanding and seeing that through that perspective. I understand that sometimes we make advances, sometimes we go backwards, but if people keep pressing on together with allies, we can make change. And I think that gives me hope. There are a lot of things right now that I think are going to take a long time to repair, and I want to be here to see them, and I want my children to be able to experience them, and that I think that understanding the history and how far our country has come, how far Texas has come, how far my city, Houston, has come, gives me hope that we can make that progression and do more, but I wouldn't know that if I did not have that access to the memory and what has happened over time.
Yeah, I mean, forget everything I just said, right, for the last hour. But no, I mean, what gives me hope is I work every single day with people here in Austin, people in the state of Texas, people around the country and around the world who have dedicated their lives to speaking out against hate and extremism, but not just speaking out, like finding ways to use their skills in order to make a world a better place. So how could I not have hope when I see the hours and the commitment that people are putting for a profession, for the folks on the stage to spend their lives combating hate? I'm inspired by the people I work with, by the people I communicate with every single day. And if you can be inspired once a day, you have a good job. And if you have a good job, that should give you some hope. I have a good job in that sense where I look at terrible things, but at the same time that I'm looking at terrible things, I'm seeing the amazing beauty of people and their willingness to fight back. And it's that hope and what I see every day that makes me realize, right, that, I don't know, maybe 10 years from now, we'll be back on this stage and we'll look back and will we remember this moment for the violence and the hate and the extremism? Or will we remember what we all did to push back against that? I truly believe it's the latter, and that's why I have hope every single day.
I think we have time for a few questions from our audience. Anyone? No. I have to tell you, there's no better note to go out on than the one that Oren just sounded. That's a perfect way to end this very enlightening, very important conversation. And I want to thank our panelists, Ani, Oren, and Stephen, not only for the conversation, but for the very important work you do. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming today. Well done.